Part 2, take 2. And I never do a second take. I mean, they didn't get the first time. Well, they're going to have to send me a paycheck and then I'll. But anyway, these are the dark days. And this is basically when I use the term slaves. This is from the terminology of the Egyptians. And if you remember the Joseph story, during the 7 years of plenty and the 7 years of drought, he was number 2 to the Pharaoh. And he pretty much made the Pharaoh rich. I mean, if you're the only one who's got the wheat or barley, depending which Bible or agricultural background you have. And so, I don't remember, 500 years later, I'm sure it can be found on the internet. When the Hebrews left Egypt, they took everything. I mean, they literally licked the gold off the walls. And so this is the Egyptian account. The dark days began with the last visitation of the destroyer, and they were foretold by strange omens in the skies. All men were silent and went about with pale faces. The leaders of the slaves, which had built a city to the glory of Thom, stirred up unrest, and no man raised his arm against them. They foretold great events of which the people were ignorant, and of which the temple seers were not informed. These were days of ominous calm, when the people waited for they knew not what. The presence of an unseen doom was felt. The hearts of men were stricken. Laughter was heard no more, and grief and wailing sounded throughout the land. Even the voices of children were stilled, and they did not play together, but stood silent, with masks on their face, no doubt. The slaves became bold and insolent, and women were the possession of any man. Fear walked the land, and women became barren with terror. They could not conceive, and those with child aborted, and all men upon them. Wow. The days of stillness were followed by a time when the noise of trumpeting and shrilling was heard in the heavens, and the people became as frightened beasts without a herdsman, as donkeys. I'm putting in a different word here, although, all right, not going there. As herdsmen, as donkeys, when lions prowl without their fold. When lions prowl without their fold. Well, I think we got that one too. The people spoke of the gods of the slaves, and reckless men said, if we knew where this god were to be found, we would sacrifice to him. But the god of the slaves was not among them. He was not to be found within the swamp lands or in the brick pits. His manifestation was in the heavens for all men to see, but they did not see with understanding, nor would any man or God listen, for all were dumb because of the hypocrisy of it all. It says here the hypocrisy of men. The dead were no longer sacred and were thrown into the waters. Those already entombed were neglected, and many became exposed. They lay unprotected against the hands of thieves. He who once toiled long in the sun, bearing the yoke himself, now possessed oxen. He who grew no grain now owned a storehouse full. He who once dwelt at ease among his children now thirsted for water. He who once sat in the sun with crumbs and dregs and was now bloated with food. He reclined in the shade, his bowels overflowing. I guess that's hamburger, french fries, and beer. I don't know. Cattle were left unattended to roam into strange pastures, and men ignored their marks and slew the beasts of their neighbors. No man owned anything and was happy. Well, the public records were cast forth and destroyed, and no man knew where slaves and who were masters. The people cried out to the Pharaoh in their distress, but he stopped his ears and acted like a deaf man. There were those who spoke falsely before Pharaoh and had gods hostile towards the land. Therefore the people cried out for their blood to appease it. But it was not these strange priests who put strife in the land instead of peace, for one was even of the household of Pharaoh and walked among the people unhampered. Guess who? Moses. Dust and smoke, clouds darkened the sky and colored the waters upon which they fell with a bloody hue. Plague was throughout the land, the river was bloody, and blood was everywhere. The water was vile, and men's stomachs shrank from drinking. Those who did drink from the river vomited it up, for it was polluted. Opinion, iron oxide. The dust tore wounds in the skin of man and beasts. In the glow of the destroyer, the earth was filled with redness. Vermin bred and filled the air and face of the earth with loathsomeness. Wild beasts afflicted with torments under the lashing sand and ashes came out of their lairs in the wasteland and cave places and stalked the abodes of men. All the tame beasts whimpered, and the land was filled with the cries of sheep and moans of cattle. Trees throughout the land were destroyed, and no herb or fruit was to be found. The face of the land was battered and devastated by a hail of stones which smashed down all that stood in the path of the torrent. They swept down in hot showers, and strange flowing fire ran along the ground in their wake. The fish of the rivers died in the polluted waters. Worms, insects, and reptiles sprang up from the earth in huge numbers. Great gusts of wind brought swarms of locusts which covered the sky as a destroyer flung itself through the heavens. It blew great gusts of cinders across the face of the land. The gloom of a long night spread a dark mantle of blackness which extinguished every ray of light. None knew it was day and when it was night, for the sun cast no shadow. The darkness was not the clean blackness of night, but a thick darkness in which the breath of men was stopped in their throats. Men gasped in a hot cloud of vapor which enveloped all the land, snuffed out all lamps and fires. Men were emotionally numbed and lay moaning in their beds. None spoke to another or took food, for they were overwhelmed with despair. Ships were sucked away from the moorings and destroyed in great whirlpools. It was a time of the undoing. The earth turned over as clay spun upon a potter's wheel. The whole land was filled with uproar from the thunder of the destroyer overhead and the cry of the people. There, as the sound of moaning and lamentation on every side, the earth spewed up its dead. Corpses were cast up out of their resting places, and the embalmed were revealed to the sight of all men. Pregnant women miscarried, and the seed of men was stopped. The craftsman left his task undone. The potter abandoned his wheel, and the carpenters his tools, and they departed to dwell in the marshes. All crafts were neglected, and the slaves lured the craftsmen away. The dues of Pharaoh could not be collected, for there was neither wheat nor barley, goose nor fish. The rights of Pharaoh could not be enforced, for the fields of grain and the pastures were destroyed. The highborn and the lowly prayed together that life might come to an end, and the turmoil and the thundering ceased to beat upon their ears. Terror was companion of men by day, and horror the companion by night. Men lost their senses, became mad. They were distracted by frightfulness. On the great night of the destroyer's wrath, when its terror was at its height, there was a hail of rocks, and the earth heaved, as paint. That's a misspelled word. Excuse me. I guess it's oxide paint. There was a hail of rock, and the earth heaved as the pain rent her bowels. Gates, columns, walls were consumed by fire, and the statues of God were overthrown and broken. People fled outside their dwellings in fear and were slain by the hail. Those who took shelter from the hail were swallowed when the earth split open. The habitation of men collapsed upon those inside, and there was panic on every hand. But the slaves who lived in the huts and the reed lands at the place of pits, that's the brick pits, and the land of the reeds or the marshes, were spared. The land burnt like tinder. A man watched upon his rooftop, and the heaven hurled wrath upon him, and he died. The land wreathed under the wrath of the destroyer, and groaned with the agony of Egypt. It shook itself, and the temples and palaces of the nobles were thrown down from their foundations. The high-born ones perished in the midst of the ruins, and all the strength of the land was stricken. Even the great one, the firstborn of Pharaoh, died with the high-born in the midst of the terror and falling stones. The children of princes were cast out into the streets, and those who were not cast out died within their abodes. There were 9 days of darkness and upheaval, while a tempest raged such as never had been known before. When it passed away, brother buried brother throughout the land. Men rose up against those in authority and fled from the cities to dwell in tents in the outlands. Egypt lacked great men to deal with the times. The people were weak from fear and bestowed gold, silver, lapis lazuli, turquoise, copper upon the slaves, and to their priests they gave chalices, urns, and ornaments. Pharaoh alone remained calm and strong in the midst of the confusion. So this would be, the first Pharaoh died during the plagues. This one had to be his brother. And Moses was a half-brother, in my opinion. The people turned to wickedness in their weakness and despair. Harlots walked through the streets unashamed. Women paraded their limbs and flaunted their womanly charms. High-born women were in rags, and the virtuous were mocked. The slaves, spared by the destroyer, left the accursed land forthwith. Their multitudes moved in the gloom of a half-dawn, under a mantle of fine, swirling gray ash, leaving the burnt fields and shattered cities behind them. Many Egyptians attached themselves to the host, for one, who was great, led them forth, a priest prince of the inner court, who I believe is Moses. Fire mounted up on high, and its burning left with the enemies of Egypt. It rose up from the ground as a fountain and hung as a curtain in the sky. In 7 days, by Rimmah, the accursed one journeyed to the waters. They crossed the heaving wilderness while the hills melted around them. Above, the skies were torn with lightning. They were sped by terror, but their feet became entangled in the land, and the wilderness shut them in. They knew not the way, for no sign was constantly before them. They turned before Nashar and stopped at Shokoth, the place of quarries, which would be the brick quarries. They passed the waters of Maha, and came, which would be the swamp, and came by the valley of Picaroth, north of Mara. Don't know where that is, but This gives you a direction on how to look at the map. They came up against the waters which blocked their way, and their hearts were in despair. I'm sure that's the Red Sea. The night was a night of fear and dread, for there was a high moaning above. Black winds from the underworld were loosened, and fire sprang up from the ground. The hearts of the slaves shrank within them. This is Moses' group. For they knew the wrath of Pharaoh followed them, and that there was no way of escape. So if God didn't make a way, they were just going to be slaughtered. They hurled abuse on those who led them. Strange rites were performed along the shore that night. The slaves disputed among themselves, and there was violence.